Okay, so have you ever, like, when you open up your news app and it seems like every other day there's a new headline about autism,
Right.
but it's never really, it's rarely ever positive. It's
Yeah.
always like, oh, here are the risks, or this is how to prevent it. It's almost like they're framing it as this thing to be avoided,
Exactly.
which, it can be kind of disheartening, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Especially when you think about, like, how many people are actually impacted by these kinds of narratives.
Right. And how we talk about these things really matters.
Exactly.
And that's what we're diving into today.
That's what we're doing. So we're looking at this article by Jamie Horrocks. It's called The Risk of Being Born, How Autistics Make Meaning of the Neuromajority's Quest to Erase Us.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going to be using this framework, the Power Threat Meaning Framework.
Yeah.
Have you heard of this before?
I have, yeah. It's something you might not come across every day,
Yeah.
but it's actually incredibly useful, I think, for understanding how the way we talk about things, like we were just saying, impacts people's lives.
Yeah.
And especially in this case with autism.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, instead of just looking at autism as like a diagnosis, on paper, it's like,
Yeah.
how are all of these narratives, all these things, like we were just talking about with the doom and gloom,
Yeah,
how does that actually impact people in their lived experience?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where the power, threat, and meaning come in. It kind of helps unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
Like, who has the power to shape these narratives?
Okay.
What are the threats that people feel as a result of these narratives?
Yeah.
And then ultimately, what meaning do people make of their own experiences in the context of all of that?
Okay, so let's break that down then.
Yeah.
So the article starts off with this example about this study on kids born during the pandemic. And they're looking at, surprise, surprise, whether or not being born during that time might be linked to being autistic.
Right. And we see this all the time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
This isn't a one-off.
Right.
In the past, we've seen studies linking autism to all sorts of things.
As I know, right.
Vaccines, stress during pregnancy, things in the environment, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
So they're always trying to find that link.
Yeah, and it's always, again, it's like they're trying to prevent it, right?
Say.
Like it's this thing that has to be, like, stopped.
And this is where that power dynamic comes into play, right?
Okay.
Because who's usually behind these studies? Who's funding them?
Right.
It's usually not autistic people themselves. It's usually researchers, policymakers, big institutions, the neuromajority, as Horrocks puts it.
So it's like this system where the people most impacted by this research, by these findings, aren't the ones who are actually, like, leading the charge.
Exactly. And it's not to say that those groups don't have a place, but
Right, of course not.
it's that power imbalance that can be really problematic.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about, we're talking about the power threat meaning framework, right? So we've got this power imbalance, that's one,
Yep.
and then that kind of leads into this idea of threat.
Right.
Right, because if you're constantly being told that autism is this, negative, scary thing,
Yeah.
that's a threat, right?
Yeah. What does that do to a person?
Exactly, and what does that mean for, autistic people? Like, how does that impact just how they feel about themselves, how they see the world?
Well, yeah. I mean, imagine growing up hearing that the way your brain works is something people want to prevent.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
That's incredibly heavy.
Yeah. So we're already starting to see how this can be damaging, right?
Yeah.
Especially for young people who are still figuring out who they are.
Of course.
How do you develop a positive sense of self when the world is telling you that who you are is something to be avoided or fixed?
It's heartbreaking. So, okay, we've got this power imbalance that's driving these negative narratives about autism, and then that creates this sense of threat for autistic individuals. So where do we go from there? What does that actually mean for them? How do autistic people internalize these messages? And that, I'm guessing, is where the meaning part of the PTMF comes in.
Exactly. And it can be so easy to internalize those messages, right? Like when you grow up and everything around you is telling you that autism is a burden or a tragedy or something that needs to be prevented.
Right.
It's really hard not to start believing that about yourself.
Absolutely. And it's like the world is basically saying, we'd rather you hadn't been born.
And that's essentially Herrick's point.
Yeah.
She says it, she has this really powerful quote in the article.
Okay.
She says, when the majority of research dollars are spent looking for ways to prevent autistic births rather than supporting autistic people, it becomes increasingly clear that society wishes we were never born in the first place.
Wow. Yeah, that quote is really something. It makes you think, like, Where's the research on how to just make the world a more welcoming and inclusive place for autistic people?
Right. And that's a really important question because while there is so much focus on preventing autism, what causes it, how to prevent it,
Right.
there's also a lot of really incredible work being done to improve the lives of autistic people right now.
Oh, absolutely.
And Horrocks actually highlights a really good example in the article, the Buckland Review.
Yeah, I've heard of that one. I'm not sure if our listeners are familiar with it, though.
Okay, yeah.
Could you give us like a little rundown?
Yeah, so the Buckland Review is this report that came out in 2016 in the UK.
Okay.
And it was kind of groundbreaking because it totally flips the script on how we typically approach autism.
Okay.
So instead of focusing on, the causes or cures for autism,
Yeah,
it focuses on solutions.
I like that.
It's like, okay, autistic people are here. They're part of our communities. How do we make things better?
Okay, so what kind of better are we talking about?
So it covers a really wide range of areas:
Mm.
employment, education, housing, social support.
Okay.
All those things that can make a real difference in the quality of life for autistic people.
So like tangible things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, for example, one thing it emphasizes is the need for more autism-informed employment practices.
Okay.
So imagine a workplace where instead of trying to fit autistic employees into a neurotypical mold,
Yeah,
employers actually value and support their unique strengths and perspectives.
that would be amazing.
Right.
What else does it highlight?
Well, it also talks about the importance of creating accessible and inclusive environments.
Mm-hmm.
Because for some autistic people, sensory overload can be a real challenge.
Right.
So imagine if public spaces, workplaces, even schools were designed with sensory sensitivities in mind.
Yeah.
Think about how much more comfortable and inclusive those spaces could be.
It seems like such common sense when you lay it all out like that,
Right.
but so often we miss the mark.
Totally. And that makes me think, if all of these solutions are out there,
Right.
why aren't we seeing more progress? Why are we still so stuck on this idea of preventing autism?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with that power dynamic. It's like
Sure.
we're so busy trying to fix what we perceive as wrong that we forget to ask if maybe the world itself needs to be more accommodating.
And that reminds me of this quote by Steve Silberman.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote Neurotribes.
Right.
And he said something like, we spend so much time trying to make autistic people more neurotypical that we forget to ask if the world itself needs to be more autistic.
Yeah, that's such a good quote.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, what would happen if we just shifted our focus, from preventing autism to embracing neurodiversity?
It's huge.
Like, what if we started seeing all of the amazing things that autistic people bring to the table,
Absolutely.
their unique strengths, their perspectives? What if, instead of trying to make autistic people fit in, we created a world where they could truly belong?
That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Belonging and acceptance.
Exactly. But how do we get there? How do we make that shift? How do we go from talking about autism as this scary thing, this risk, to recognizing it as a valuable form of diversity?
Yeah, it's a big question. It is a big question.
It feels huge. Like, where do we even start?
Well, I think a good place to start is by, actually listening to autistic people.
Okay.
Like seeking out their perspectives, their stories,
Mm-hmm.
reading what they have to say,
Yeah.
amplifying their voices.
Okay.
Because, they're the ones who actually know what it's like to be autistic, right?
Of course.
And they're the ones who could tell us what would actually make a difference.
It's about, instead of speaking for them, creating space for them to speak for themselves.
Exactly. And beyond just listening, though, we can all be advocates for change,
Okay.
So, supporting organizations that prioritize autistic voices.
Advocating for more funding for things like, we were talking about the Buckland Review.
Right, yeah.
Like more of that, and also challenging that narrative
Yeah.
that autism is something to be afraid of.
Right.
It's about embracing it as just a different way of being.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that, the world needs autistic joy and autistic creativity and autistic perspectives just as much as it needs any other kind of diversity.
100%. And you know what? It's not even just about making the world a better place for autistic people.
Right.
Although that's obviously a huge part of it.
Of course.
But when we embrace neurodiversity, we all benefit.
Okay, I like
Think about the innovations we could have, the insights we could gain from a world that values different ways of thinking and being.
Yeah. It's not about fixing anybody. It's about making the world work for everybody.
Exactly. What if, instead of seeing autism as a problem to be solved,
Yeah. We started to see it as just a different way of experiencing the world. with its own, strengths, its own challenges.
I love that. That is something that I am going to be thinking about long after this deep dive is over.
Good.
And hopefully something our listeners will too.
I hope so.
So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
This was fantastic, and thank you to our listeners. We'll see you next time.